Here's Bill McKee.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I am shocked that there are this many people on a rainy day to come hear Bill McKee talk. My paying job is I'm the provost at Cumberland University, and I always start by thanking the university for allowing me to spend time doing this kind of thing. Cumberland is 184 years old this year and located in Lebanon, and it's a wonderful place. I hope sometime that we could have one of your events there if it's not too far to travel. I'm also on the Metro Historical Commission, and this is part of my give back for the mayor allowing me to serve on that particular board. So, we're going to talk today, and I'm going to ask you some questions from time to time. Are you ready? We're going to talk about the journey of statehood for the state of Tennessee. Now, how many of you know a lot about how Tennessee became a state? Hold up your hands very high. Oh, well, I've got to be careful in what I say. Hey, Dr. Richmond, one of my fellow commissioners on the Historical Commission. Well, everybody has a birthday. Don't you agree to that? And there are some people who have two birthdays.
Other than the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, I don't know about the Jehovah's Witnesses, but I was thinking of Queen Elizabeth. You know, she had a birthday on the day she was born, on April the 21st, and then her national birthday was always in June at the Trooping of the Colors, because they couldn't plan when the monarch would be born, and they wanted to have the event during the summer when they could draw a crowd. And so, unfortunately, she was born in April, and I wish she had been born 2 days later, because she and I could then have shared a birthday, not the same year, but the same date. Well, Tennessee became a state on June the 1st, 1796. Now, if my math is right, that's 228 years ago. Now, contrary to the belief held by most students on the Cumberland campus, I was not here for the founding of statehood. Now, Cumberland was once a part of the state of North Carolina. And when my niece was in elementary school, she said to me, "Uncle Bill, do you know how Cumberland became a state?" I said, "I think so, but you need to tell me." She said, "Well, everybody knows it was just chopped off from the state of North Carolina," which is not true. But you don't correct a middle school student about her teacher, because that wouldn't have been good for her moving forward in middle school. But prior to statehood, after we were chopped off from the state of North Carolina, we became the territory southwest of the river Ohio. Now, how many of you knew about that second step? Well, there are 4 hands up now. There were only 2 before, so I don't have to be quite as careful. And if you really want to know a lot more about the territory southwest of the river Ohio, Walter Durham, one of our former state historians, has written a really wonderful book about that that's part of the Nashville library system. So if you want to know more about that, I commend that book to you. Now, as we start to think about this journey from being a part of North Carolina to statehood, Why did North Carolina want to be rid of us? Well, I don't think they necessarily did, but they owed the federal government a lot of money. Why did they owe the government a lot of money? Because they had to pay for service for people in the Revolutionary War. And when they didn't have any money, what did they have? Land. You're exactly right. And so we became part of a bartering deal where land was given for money. Now, why did the people who would become Tennesseans want to break away from North Carolina? Because we were way, way, way far away, and they were not giving us appropriate protection from the Native Americans that we felt that we should have. So they believed that the federal government would provide more protection for people in this area. And we all know the story about Fort Nashville and the Indians attacking and the dogs being turned on the Indians. How many of you know that story? Well, there's far more hands up this time, so I'm not going to get into that because you might catch me. Because in this era, in this area, the Indians were preying a lot on the settlers because the settlers were taking their land, especially.
And they were instigated by the British and the French to attack the Americans.
Well, there is some truth in that. In fact, a whole lot of truth in that. Because they got them stirred up. And
But the Indians were not here. This was not, there was no permanent Indian
No.
settlement on the Cumberland.
but this was a great hunting ground.
But it was a bloody hunting ground, and they had largely given it up.
Well, thank you. You know more about this than I do. Well, when we became a territory, George Washington was president, and he appointed a territorial governor, and he appointed a territorial secretary. Those were direct appointments from the president. And William Blount was appointed as the territorial governor. And who was the territorial secretary? Daniel Smith, who was a Middle Tennessean. Now, we think of the secretary of the territory as sort of being a distant officer, but really he was the secondary governor. He was in charge when the governor was, quote, off the territory, end of quote. So if we look at today in our organizational structure of the state of Tennessee, the governor and the secretary of state are our two oldest officers. In fact, they really precede statehood. Now, there are a lot of women in this room, so here's my next question for you. How many women have served as Secretary of State of the state of Tennessee? Try this. One. Mary Hart Oliver Carr was the only woman that's ever served as Secretary of State. And she served because her husband was the Secretary of State and he joined the military in World War II. And so Governor Prentice Cooper appointed her as the acting Secretary of State, and then the legislature elected her. When the war was over and Joe came home, she resigned so that he could have, quote, his office back. Now, all right, let me ask you this question. How many constitutional officers does the state of Tennessee have?
Three.
All right, what are they?
Treasurer, comptroller,
And the Secretary of State. Now, how many women have been constitutional officers in either of the other two positions? One. Jean Bodfish served as comptroller of the Treasury, and she is the only other officer. So, ladies, you've got to get busy and convince the legislature that you need to serve.
When was that?
Jean was in the 1970s, 1980s, something like that. She was a finance professor at Vanderbilt before she served, and then she went back to her appointment at the university after she did serve. Well, Tennessee wanted to become a state, and there were rules. There were rules to become a state. And one rule was that you had to have 60,000 distinct citizens. And an enumerator was appointed. Now, what does an enumerator do? Counts. And so we would call this the first census taker, seeing if we could be a state. And we made the grade. We had 77,262 citizens. So that was over the 60,000 required. And the next step, yes, ma'am.
Did that include women?
Yes, it did. Thank you for asking that question. If you didn't hear that question was, did that enumeration include women?
And did it include enslaved people?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. The record doesn't indicate whether it did or whether it didn't, so I'm not going to make a guess. Yes, ma'am.
And you had described this territory as Ohio something.
It was the territory southwest of the river Ohio. That was its.
Kentucky, too.
Yeah, it
So
include.
like Kentucky?
Yeah.
too? Okay.
Thank you for helping me be sure that I give all the information. So the census was taken, and a constitutional convention was called, and it was to be held in Knoxville. Now, why do you think it was held in Knoxville?
More people over there.
Yeah, because remember, how did citizens primarily, there was not a road system in those days. So citizens came from the eastern part of our state down the river. And so that was how we sort of began to populate the Middle Tennessee area. And the Constitutional Convention was called on January 11th, 1796 in the office of David Henley. And David Henley was the agent for the War Department. Now, there's an interesting story about David Henley. And if you know much about Knoxville, or if you know much about there's a major street in Knoxville named Henley Street, which runs parallel to the main drag, which is called Gay Street in Knoxville. And David Henley was a spy, because President Washington wasn't too sure about these frontiers people. And he wanted to keep an eye on the Constitutional Convention. So in David's instance, he was a spy, and he reported to the president what was going on at the Constitutional Convention. There were 11 counties from the old state of North Carolina in Tennessee, and each county elected 55 people to the Constitutional Convention. I mean, excuse me, 5 people. There were a total of 55. Oh, I about blew that, didn't I? So there were 55. And they were all men. No women, no African Americans, no American natives. And the original counties were, and I'm going to tell you what the original counties were, and you're going to tell me the county seats. Can you do that? Some. Well, first was Blount County. What's the county seat? No, not right. Maryville. Thank you. Thank you. Kim, I spent some time in Knoxville, and I had to figure out it wasn't Maryville, it was Merville. But I was trying to be uplifting today about my education and not say it that way. Davidson, what was the county seat? Nashville. Greene County. Greenville. Hawkins County.
Dandridge.
No, that's Jefferson County. No. Hawkins County, Rogersville. Now, that was just on the tip of everybody's tongue, I know. Jefferson County, Dandridge, that's right. Knox County, this is a hard one. Knoxville. Sullivan County, Blountville, you're exactly right.
My husband's from Sullivan.
All right. Tennessee County, Clarksville, you're right. Sumner County, Gallatin, and Washington County.
Johnson City.
Mm-mm. Jonesboro. Whoever said that was right.
Jonesboro was in the next county, in Johnson County.
Not then.
Oh, okay.
So we're talking about a different time, you know. Now, there are two counties that Tennessee once had that it doesn't have anymore, because how many counties do we have today? 95. Now, there were two counties that we once had that we don't have anymore. Now, I gave you the answer to the first one. There's no more Tennessee County. It was dissolved right after we became a state, and its territory was Montgomery, Robertson, parts of Stewart, Dixon, Cheatham, and Houston. It was a large area of land. The other county that we don't have, anybody want to guess? Well, I was in the office of the former state historian, Walter Durham, and there was this map about the size of this wall up on there. Beautiful, beautiful map. And he said, "Bill, I'll buy you lunch if you can tell me what's wrong with that map." And I said, "Walter, have you got any money? Because you're just about to have to buy me lunch." Because when I looked at it, James County was still on that map. Now, James County was dissolved in 1919. And it was originally cut off as a part of Hamilton County. And when it was dissolved, it went back to Hamilton County. Now, why did James County go away? Any guesses?
Why was it created in the first place?
Because they took the census and decided that they wanted that county. So it's just the same way that all the counties in Tennessee were determined. It went bankrupt. And the county seat of James County was Ottawa. And if you go to Ottawa today, you can still see the old courthouse that was there when it was a county. Now, some of the 55 men that were elected to the Constitutional Convention became famous individuals, and some did not. 3 would become governors of the state of Tennessee: John Sevier, Joseph McMinn, and Archibald Rome. They would later serve as governors of the new state. One would become governor of Louisiana, William C.C. Claiborne. Here's the easy one. One would become president of the United States. Andrew Jackson, that's right. 6 would become United States senators. William Blount, William Koch, Joseph Anderson, Andrew Jackson, William Claiborne, and Daniel Smith. 4 would become United States representatives. Andrew Johnson, William Claiborne, John Ray, and John Sevier. Now, what do all these people have in common? Other than, well, they may have all been rich. I don't know about that. But other than being a member of the Constitutional Convention, what did all these men have in common?
Most of them have a county name.
Not most, all have a county name for them. One would become one of my favorite Nashville historical characters, John McNary. And I'm going to digress from talking about the state of Tennessee for just a moment to talk about John McNary, because he's a current resident not far from here in the Nashville City Cemetery. John McNary holds the distinction of being a judge of 4 different jurisdictions and never moved his residence. His first, when he came to Nashville, he was the district judge for the state of North Carolina. And he was the first district judge, and he got to pick the district attorney. And what he wanted was a cocky young man to come to the wilderness with him. And he chose Andrew Jackson, who became the first district attorney for Davidson County, and that's how he became a Nashvillian. His second level of judgeship was in the territory southwest of the river Ohio. His third jurisdiction was he was a judge for the state of Tennessee. And his fourth jurisdiction was he was the federal judge for the state of Tennessee appointed by President Washington. Now, I don't know how many federal judges we have now, but we have a whole lot of them. And our population and our system is different now than it was then. Now, who were these people, these 55 men? None of them were native Tennesseans. They were not born in the territory. 8 were from Pennsylvania, 5 from North Carolina, 4 from South Carolina, and 3 from Maryland. Now, I want to talk a little more about Judge McNary. The rumors are that Fort Negley has a lot of underground caves, tunnels, right? And who built the fort? African Americans, prisoners from the Civil War, or as my grandmother called it, the late unpleasantness. That's a term that probably your grandmothers used.
It's been a Rocky Bullwinkle cartoon, too.
Was it a Rocky book?
Once somebody you adopts a Confederate battle plan, and they call it, this is from the Civil War, and you see this, like Colonel Sanders there with the beard and the whole bit, he comes in, I'm from the Confederate League of Confederate Defenders, and we don't like that word civil.
I see.
And then they start winning their ball game. He said, "Oh, okay, we'll go with civil."
Okay. Well, he's buried in the city cemetery, and this story I have never been able to prove, but it's been told from generation to generation of Nashvillians that the people who were imprisoned in the fort wanted to escape. And they found a series of caves and tunnels under the fort. And little by little, they connected them. And all of a sudden, they burst out of Judge McNary's tomb and ran away. I don't tell this to students I teach because I'm afraid they'll go look for this system of tunnels. Now, I don't know whether it's true or not, but it is certainly an old wives' tale that has been told here for a long, long period of time. And I like Judge McNary because when the city cemetery was being refurbished, and they were doing a lot of work over there. Do you all remember when all that was happening? It took, I am told, 3 tractors to move the slab off of Judge McNary's grave. Now, if that's true, I don't think any prisoners pushed that up and ran away. But that's just me thinking. The cost of the Constitutional Convention was $3,007. You want to guess what that is in today's money? It's a lot. As of this morning, it was $100,025.57. The delegates made $1.50 a day per diem. Now, here's where they made their money if they had to come from Nashville. They made $1.50 per 30 miles that they traveled to the convention in Knoxville and back home again. Now, I'm telling you, they rode horses. That would not have been an easy trip for $1.50 per 30 miles. There were other expenses. Seats and tables cost $10. Oilcloth cost $2.62. Firewood candles and candle stands were $22.50. Those were some deals, I'm sure, back in the day. The convention was opened with a prayer, a long one, given by Samuel Carrick, who was a Presbyterian minister. Now, most people don't know Samuel Carrick by the fact that he was a Presbyterian minister or that he delivered the prayer at the Constitutional Convention. But if you're a volunteer, you know that he was one of the founders of the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. You always have to say at Knoxville now because they're not the real campuses, but they're other campuses of the University of Tennessee. So guess where I graduated? From the real campus. You're exactly right. The Constitution set up 2 houses of the legislature, the House of Representatives and the State Senate. And that was patterned against the American system of a House of Representatives called the People's House and the Senate, which at that time was called the State House, because United States senators prior to 1912 were elected by the General Assemblies of the state of Tennessee, not by the people. So Tennessee deviated from that because both houses of our legislature were elected by citizens. We have 99 representatives and 33 senators. The Constitution set up a 3-to-1 ratio. And so if we've had that number for a long time and our population has grown, How do we keep that ratio? We expand the area of their service area. So, you know, in the early days, the legislative districts were much smaller than they are today. Now, in order to serve, you must profess in God, be a male of 21 years old, own 200 acres, and if you wanted to be governor, you had to own 500 acres. You had to be free to practice religion, and the legislature would meet every other year. And I want you to think about this for a moment, because we don't think about this much. Tennessee is set up on the monarchical system. Now, when I lived in Georgia and we voted, our ballot looked like a bed sheet. We elected the governor, the lieutenant governor, the secretary of state, the attorney general, the commissioner of agriculture, the commissioner of education. I can go on and on. In Tennessee, only one state official is elected by the people as a whole, and that's our governor. We elect 2 United States senators, but they're federal, not state officers. So in essence, every 4 years, we elect a king, and the king appoints most of the rest of the government, with some exceptions. Now, if I ask the current Attorney General, are you an elected officer of the state of Tennessee? He would say yes. But there are only 5 votes in the election. Now, who votes for the Attorney General?
Tennessee Supreme Court.
That's exactly right. The justices in concert of the Supreme Court of the state of Tennessee elect the Attorney General. If I said to the Secretary of State, are you an elected public official? He would say yes. How many votes are in his election?
132.
132. And where do we get the 132? The members of the Senate and the House come together to elect not only the Secretary of State, but the Comptroller of the Treasury and the State Treasurer. So the only officer that we elect as a citizenry is our governor. Now, when the Constitution was being written, there was some urgency about it because it had to get to Philadelphia, which was the capital at that time, before the Congress adjourned, because the Congress had to elect us to be a state. And there was no real problem with us passing the House of Representatives, but there was a problem of us passing the Senate. And they wanted our state delayed until after the next presidential election. And here's why. And I want you to think about our recent election.
Yeah.
I want you to think about the United States Senate for just a moment in our recent election. The Federalists, which was a political party of that day, had the most senators. The Jeffersonian Democrat Republicans were the minority party. And they believed that Tennessee would send senators of the minority party, which would make them the majority party. So I want things haven't changed, have they, in 228 years in some ways? So what happened is, finally, on the very last day, the Congress was in session. Through some politicking, I'm sure, Tennessee was elected by both houses to receive statehood, and President Washington assigned our letter of statehood on June the 1st, 1796. Now, for Washington, that was a particularly important thing because there were 13 original states. What was the 14th state? Vermont. New Hampshire was an original one. Then Kentucky, and then us. And one of Washington's goals was to move the country beyond the Atlantic seaboard into the more interior parts of our land. And so he was very hopeful that at that time that there would be an additional states. Now we talked about people who were famous of the 55 men. You remember that? Well, let's talk about some not so famous. Is that okay? James Houston. How many of you have ever heard of James Houston? He operated a still. That's how he made his living. He was very popular at the Constitutional Convention because he would bring his wares to share with the other members. Joel Lewis was a tavern operator. Stephen Brooks was the chairman of the convention that organized the Grand Lodge of Tennessee for free and accepted Masons. And he served as the leader of the Manumission Society, which was the first group in America to focus on abolishing slavery. Now, there's an interesting story about the abolishment of slavery, if I could digress just one more minute or two. How many of you have ever heard of Return Jonathan Meigs? Thank you. Charles, I think you probably wrote an article on him at one time. Return Jonathan Meigs was the first state librarian. We don't remember him for that either. But he was an attorney down in Lower East Tennessee, and he wanted to run for the Constitutional Convention of 1834. And he ran on a single sort of ticket. If you vote for me and I get elected to the Constitutional Convention, I am going to introduce a bill to amend the Constitution to abolish slavery in the state of Tennessee. That was his ticket. That's what he ran on. And he lost by one vote. Let's fast forward to the Constitutional Convention of 1834. Someone else introduced that same amendment to the Constitution, and it lost by one vote. So if it had passed, Tennessee would have abolished slavery 34 years before the beginning of the Civil War. And would that have made it a distinct difference on whether we would have been a Confederate state?
When the states, particularly the northern states, abolished slavery, it generally wasn't to take effect immediately. It would be after some future date.
Well, this would have been when the new Constitution of 1834 went into effect. But it didn't materialize because it didn't pass. So what would have happened, just think a moment, would we have been a Confederate state? Or would we not have been a Confederate state? That's one of the great sort of ironies that you think about
Because didn't pass the first go around.
That's exactly right. It took 2 votes for Tennessee to withdraw from the Union. And interestingly enough, a Tennessean was president at the end of the war between the states, and we were the last state out and the first state back. So I think, you know, that's one of the sort of mysteries that I've pondered as a historian about what would have happened if, and there are all kinds of things, what would have happened if in history a lot of different ways. Samuel Fraser established the Society of Friends, which we call the Quaker Church in Tennessee, in 1793. He was a member of that Constitutional Convention. Spencer Clack was a member of the Constitutional Convention, and he designed the Great Seal of the state of Tennessee. And so when he was up in years, they asked him, a person in his county newspaper asked him, what are you most proud of, serving in the Constitutional Convention or designing the seal of the great state of Tennessee? And he said, neither. My proudest achievement in my life was giving the land for the Little Pigeon Baptist Church where my family worships. And that church is still in existence today. James Ford was a ferry operator on the Cumberland and the Red Rivers. And he had an interesting pricing structure. If you wanted to go across the river on his ferry, he would take a man and his horse across the river for 8 pennies. He would take the horse alone across the river for 4 pennies. History does not tell us what happened to the horse when it got on the other side. William Prince was an undertaker, but many of the people who served in the Constitutional Convention became our earliest county officers. They had to be respected members of the community, or they would not have been elected to the Constitutional Convention to begin with. So some served as members of the quarterly court. Now, do you know that term?
Oh, yeah, let's say, like the council.
We call it in Nashville and Davidson County, we call it the council, Metropolitan Council, and we have council members or counselors.
The old term for the county administrator was a judge.
And the old term was the county judge. Now, in some counties, it's called the what? The county commission to this day. And they're called commissioners. But when it was the quarterly court, they were called magistrates. And why were they called magistrates? Because they had certain judicial duties. They could marry people. The council members in Davidson County can still do that. But now, think about it. Think about it. If you could be a magistrate of the quarterly court, or if you could be a council member, I would choose to be a magistrate of the quarterly court because I could see myself wearing the white wig and a black robe. But I think that probably went out of style. Some were justices of the peace, some were sheriffs, some were tax collectors, some were county clerks. But each of those 55 men, when they didn't become governors or United States senators or United States congressmen, helped establish the system in county government that we still use today. So, comments or questions? Yes, sir.
It's a little off subject, but well, first of all, was John Overton a member of the convention?
I'm not sure.
The way I understand it, Andrew Jackson and John Overton found in Memphis. Of course, it was Overton Park there. But I've never read anything about follows up on that. I assume they made a fortune off of this. And do you know anything about the details of how they managed all this and what kind of money they made?
I have no idea whether they became rich over the founding of Shelby County or not. I have a guess,
Yeah.
but I don't know. But maybe that's something I need to look into. Maybe that's another day. I'll come back in just a minute.
Does a copy of the original census still exist?
If it does, it's at the at the Tennessee State Library and Archives. That's where the original Constitution is housed. They bring it out on certain days where citizens can go out and see it, usually around June 1st when it's the anniversary of the founding of the state. That would be a great question for Trent Hayner at the State Library and Archives. Yes, sir.
I believe that there was a vote of all Tennesseans before we were admitted as a state.
That's correct.
Whether the citizens wanted to be a new state. And in Davidson County, the vote was against statehood. But what would be the reasons that the citizens here would have not wanted statehood or would have been suspicious of it, or?
I don't know.
What was the downside of becoming a state?
I don't know. Political issues in communities, probably, but I don't know for sure. But interestingly enough, in that state vote, if you were a citizen, African American men had a right to vote in the citizenship election, in the statehood election.
Free blacks. You mean.
Free black men,
blacks
yes,
came out
uh-huh.
of That Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
You described Tennessee early on in your talk about being the land to the southwest of the Ohio.
River, Ohio, yeah.
The
Mhm.
river Ohio, yes. And then Kentucky became a state in '92, and Tennessee not till '96. So what separated them before the conventions?
Probably census and citizen numbers, because you had to have 60,000. And Kentucky, the movement from Virginia to Kentucky was before the movement from North Carolina to Tennessee.
They have been Virginians before, not.
They had been Virginians, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that Washington had a spy at the convention.
Mm-hmm.
The man who was hosting.
Yeah, and he had served with Washington in the Continental Army.
So why would Washington have felt the need to have a spy?
Because-
Is there any possibility of secession? Did that ever occur to the people west of the Appalachians as they were considering their future?
There was a Spanish
There was
conspiracy,
some,
1787.
Yeah.
it was Spanish.
Louisiana was not part of the United States.
No, no.
And then, I'm thinking of what happened under Aaron Burr. There was some talk of secession. I wondered if there was any at that time.
I'm not sure about the question, but I would say that that there was a French and a Spanish influence both here. But I would say that had negated to some degree, and probably not as prevalent as it once was, because people were moving across the mountains, and they considered themselves Americans at that point. But stranger things have happened. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any, I don't have any sense of what the records look like of the conversations during the Constitutional Convention, but do you know?
There is a journal.
Do you know of any mention about women?
Candidly, it's been a long time since I've looked at that journal, but it was a note keeper keeping the journal. So there wasn't any kind of electronic equipment or anything that we use today to keep very accurate minutes. So I don't know whether there was or not, but
Letters from people back home?
Yeah.
I'm just curious whether.
yeah. Thank you for the question. I wish I knew your answer. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Daniel Smith was Daniel Smith the same person that did the map, the first map of Tennessee?
Yeah, and he was a surveyor, lived in Sumner County. In fact, his home is still maintained there, I think, by the Daughters, it's either the Daughters of the War of 1812 or the Daughters of the American Revolution. I'm not sure which group does. Somebody in here may know the answer to that. Yes, sir.
What impact did the role of trying to form the lost state of Franklin have on Tennessee?
Well, the lost state of Franklin was in Tennessee and part of North Carolina and Virginia. And I think it was our first look at statehood. But it was not, it could not get through. You know, there's some reasons why. A lot of them probably, but I believe that was the first real focus of statehood in this region. And think about being another state and giving up the territory. That would be one of the things. So if the state of Franklin had chopped off some of North Carolina and chopped off some of Virginia, Tennessee, we were still a territory, but not then. But that's about the closest I can come to answering that question. There's a lot recently that's been sort of going back and looking at the state of Franklin as a forerunner of us. And I think that's a good piece of history that we'll need to continue to do. Yes, ma'am.
You might maybe mention this. When we were formed as a state, was Kentucky excluded?
Yes, Kentucky was a state before we were.
Before us, okay.
Yeah, and part of the interesting thing is where did Kentucky end and where did Tennessee begin? And you know the story, where did North Carolina end and where did Tennessee begin? And the story of a drunk surveyor who gave us a little more property than we should have had, but
we understand Tennessee has in the Constitution a right to revolution, which was used
in the current Constitution?
Well, in the original Constitution, at least. And the way I heard it, I heard it from Norman Parks, who was a professor at MTSU. He said Tennessee has a right to revolution, and it was used after the Battle of Athens in 1946, when the corrupt governments overthrown by people with guns. They justified it on Tennessee's right to revolution. So I wonder if you know about that.
I would not take that to a current court.
They didn't.
You know, a lot of things happened when you were in the frontier that we wouldn't consider appropriate today. I think that would certainly be one of them. But when you look at, Thomas Jefferson said that the Tennessee Constitution was the least imperfect document written at that time, prior to that time. Now, he couldn't say it was good. He couldn't bring himself to say that. It was the least imperfect.
You mentioned the state of Franklin. I'm not familiar at all with that.
There was an attempt at statehood before the state of Tennessee, and it was in the upper East Tennessee region, in that area, and it did not come to fruition.
1780s?
Yeah.
81 to 84.
Yeah, 81 to 84, something like that. Thank you for those dates. There's not a terribly lot of credence given to that now, and I think that's wrong. I think we need to think more about that, and thank you for raising that question a few minutes ago. Yes, Ken?
Because of the power in the Senate, United States Senate, was there ever an effort, maybe in the 1820s or 1830s, to split Tennessee become 2 states and therefore have 4, there would be 4 senators that defend slavery.
That's called the Texas Plan. Texas, at one time, there was a belief that it could be divided into a number of different states. Yeah.
Condition of its admission to statehood.
Uh-huh. And so I don't know that it was here. There's still discussion about that, though, in California today, about whether there would be the state of Southern California and the state of Northern California.
We send the southern part down to Mexico forever, right?
Thank you for that geographical information. And in the piece of that, you know, at one time, there are numbers of people who are old enough in this room to remember the 3 states of Tennessee. You know, that was the slogan of one of our former governors, and as you drove in, it would say, "Welcome to the 3 states of Tennessee," because Tennessee East, Tennessee Middle, and Tennessee West certainly are different. You know, there are 95 counties, and the real small counties are in East Tennessee. You know why? Because a citizen can't be more than a half a day's horse ride from his home to the county seat. Because you had to be able to get to the county seat, conduct your business, and get home in the same day. And you're going up and down hills in East Tennessee. When you get to West Tennessee, it's flat. And you don't have as much trouble or the length of time of going up and down the hills and wearing out the poor horse, so they have larger counties out there. Yes, ma'am.
Did I hear you right, there was a second constitutional convention?
There have been 3. The original 1834 and then the current constitutional, the Constitutional Convention. And why do politician people not like the thought of having a constitutional convention?
Opens up the door for change.
Well, if you have a constitutional convention, everything is up for grabs.
Unless it's a limited kind.
Well, you can do a limited constitutional convention, but everything is up for grabs. And the last time we did that was in 1953, I believe. And I believe Prentice Cooper was the chairman of the Constitutional Convention. But we do the changes by amendments, and that's a very narrowly worded thing. And Tennessee it's very difficult in Tennessee to get a constitutional amendment because it has to pass one house, both houses of the General Assembly, and lay on the table, meaning that General Assembly can't pass it. It's laid upon the table, that's the term, for the next General Assembly to review. Then it has to be passed by a larger percentage of the General Assembly. So you don't see a whole lot of constitutional conventions because it's very, very cumbersome to do. In California, as an example, a select number of citizens can sign a petition, and if they have the right number to sign the petition, that constitutional that constitutional amendment goes on the ballot.
So give an example of the opposite.
That's yin and yang. You're exactly right.
Did we have a constitutional convention following the Civil War?
Yes,
Okay.
and that was
1670?
yeah, 1870. Yeah,
1870.
Why did we have one in 1952?
53. Change the. Think about Frank Clement for a moment. He was the last 2-year governor and the first 4-year governor. So we changed governors every 2 years to that point, and there was a thought that they were going to elongate that, and then there were other what I would call housekeeping functions primarily.
And then around 1980, we had a limited constitutional convention to deal with the interest rate limitations.
And borrowing.
Huh?
And borrowing.
Borrowing, yeah.
53 convention is when we abolished the poll tax.
Yes.
That's why we're not the only ex-Confederate state not under the Civil Rights Act of 1965.
Yeah, say that again because that's a very important piece. loudly.
Oh, the reason we don't have, that Tennessee is the only ex-Confederate state that is not under the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, because we abolished the poll tax in 1953. The reason we abolished the poll tax is just like what I talked about a few weeks ago. These political bosses around the state, they pay the poll taxes, $2 each, and then those people go and vote for whatever the machine wanted. Crump machine, or Republicans in East Tennessee, or Mayor of Nashville, or any of these people, they would vote in the primary the way the machine wanted them to vote. And that came crashing down in 1948 when Kefauver and Gordon Browning defeated the crump machine. And a few years later, they called the Constitutional Convention. They took care of that and a long list of other issues.
Yeah.
So Bill, Knoxville was the first capital of Tennessee,
Yep.
and then Kingston was capital for a day?
For a day, and then Murfreesboro, and then us. It's real interesting. Powhatan Maxey was the mayor of Nashville. Now, I've always been grateful that my mother didn't name me Powhatan. There was no permanent capital. And he went to Murfreesboro and said, I would like Nashville to be the capital, and we have a hill that we would like to buy, the citizens of Nashville would like to buy, and it took them several years to pay that off, to put the capital there. And so they moved the capital to Nashville, and it became the permanent home. The hill was owned by a fairly rich family in Nashville. The person had been ambassador to Russia. He had been a very prominent American, and his name was Campbell, and that was called Campbell's Hill. And so
It's where the first Catholic church was.
it's right across the street from where the original home of the Catholic Church was. St. Mary's of the Seven Sorrows is right there, right now, right below that. But Nashville bought the property, and the legislature voted to move here. And they moved all the state records in several wagons. Isn't that an interesting kind of thing? There were just not a lot of stuff in those days. So
Kingston, was it to get some land from the Indians or
something, I'm not sure. It was capital for one day, and it will still tell you as you go into the town that it was the former capital of
Why one day? Why one day?
I don't know.
Well, it was to keep the agreement they made with the Native Americans.
Yeah.
But then they voted to move back, I think, to Knoxville.
All right.
So they technically, they kept their word.
Well, let me say thank you so much for two things. First of all, inviting me, and secondly, for your participation in my talk today.